Maya, a determined athlete, confronts discrimination while claiming her first-class seat. Facing subtle biases, she stands firm, symbolizing resilience and equality. Her fight challenges stereotypes and inspires others to break barriers, proving everyone deserves respect and dignity. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The terminal hummed with life, its bright lights reflecting off the polished floors as travelers rushed past, focused on their destinations. Maya rolled through the crowd in her wheelchair, the clattering of her wheels cutting through the sea of footsteps. She was used to the noise, the movement, the anxious energy in airports, but today, something felt different. Today, she was preparing for a long-awaited flight, not just as an athlete who had earned her seat, but as a woman determined to take her rightful place in a world that often tried to push her aside. She approached the check-in counter, where Steve, the flight manager, stood behind the desk, tapping away at his computer. His face was professional, but there was a brief flicker in his eyes when he saw her. A momentary hesitation. Maya knew what it was. He was sizing her up. It wasn't just her wheelchair that caused the shift in his demeanor. It was the unspoken discomfort that people like him felt when they saw someone like her, someone who didn't neatly fit the stereotypes of what a first-class passenger should look like. Maya pushed her chair forward, straightening her back with all the grace she had cultivated over the years. She was used to being underestimated, but she had learned long ago that her strength wasn't just in her legs. It was in her mind, her spirit. She wouldn't let anyone tell her what she could or couldn't do. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady, polite, but with an edge that demanded respect. "I have a first-class ticket for the 10:30 flight to New York." Steve looked at her ticket, then back at her. There was a slight hesitation, a glance at her wheelchair, and then, almost imperceptibly, a shift in his posture as if he was weighing something. He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, of course," he said, his tone just a little too measured. "First class. Let me just check something." He took her ticket and stepped away, leaving Maya alone for a moment. The hum of voices around her seemed to swell, filling her ears as her mind began to race. She knew this moment, had felt it many times before. The hesitation, the subtle judgments, the quiet assumptions that people like her didn't belong in spaces that were so often reserved for people who didn't look like her. But she didn't flinch. She never flinched. She had earned this. Not just this seat on this flight, but everything she had achieved in life. Every medal, every race, every battle. She was a national athlete, and she had fought too hard to get here to let someone like Steve take that from her. When he returned, there was a forced politeness in his voice that set her teeth on edge. "It's just that, with your condition," he paused awkwardly, "it might be a bit difficult to accommodate you in first class. We'll have to make arrangements for you to be more comfortable elsewhere." Maya's brow furrowed, but her voice remained calm. "I paid for a first-class ticket," she said slowly, the words measured, "and I expect to sit in the seat I purchased." Steve's eyes flicked to her wheelchair again, as if searching for something in her that made her less deserving of the luxury she had paid for. There was a momentary flash of something in his face, an unspoken doubt, maybe even pity. "I understand, but there's just no room, and you might need more assistance than we can provide in that section. We want to make sure you're comfortable." The words stung more than she expected. The subtle dismissal, the assumption that she wouldn't be able to handle the space, the implication that her disability made her less deserving. She could feel the heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I am capable of handling my seat, Steve, and I would prefer not to be told otherwise." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The airport around them continued to buzz with the sounds of boarding announcements, rolling suitcases, and the distant clatter of trays. Maya could feel the eyes of the people behind her, watching, waiting, some shifting uncomfortably at the confrontation. She didn't care about the audience. This was her moment, her battle. She wasn't going to back down. Steve cleared his throat, shifting uneasily behind the desk. "I'll need to check with the supervisor," he said, his voice strained. "Please wait here. I'll be right back." Maya nodded, though the gesture felt like a forced submission. She watched as he walked away, his stiff back retreating into the crowd of passengers. It didn't take much to know what was happening behind the scenes. The wheels were already turning in his head. How to handle this without making a scene, how to avoid an argument. She could feel it. But Maya wasn't just a passenger in this airport. She was a fighter, and she wasn't going to be treated like an afterthought. As she sat there waiting, her thoughts turned inward. The years of training, the sacrifices, the pain she had endured. She had pushed through countless barriers, both physical and societal. But this was different. This wasn't about speed or strength. This was about something deeper. It was about respect, about recognition. And in that moment, Maya realized something. This wasn't just about her. This was for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. For everyone who had ever been told to stay in their lane, to know their place, to accept what they were given. She wasn't going to accept it. Not today. Not ever. The minutes ticked by, the tension rising with every passing second. And then, Steve returned, a flurry of apologies on his lips. He was holding her boarding pass, his face flushed with an expression that could have been embarrassment, or maybe it was guilt. He looked like a man caught in a web he didn't know how to untangle. "I'm sorry for the confusion, Miss Jenkins," he said, almost too quickly. "We've arranged for a different seating. I'll walk you to your new area." Maya's heart clenched at the words. She had been here before. This was how it always started. An apology followed by another arrangement that wasn't actually an arrangement at all. It was a way to placate, to calm, to brush the problem under the rug. But Maya wasn't going to let that happen. She looked him in the eye and said, "I'm going to sit in first class. I've paid for it, and I'm not going anywhere until I'm seated where I belong." The words hung in the air, sharp and unwavering. Steve stood frozen, caught between the passengers behind him in the conversation that was unfolding. Maya's heart raced, but she held her ground. The sound of her wheelchair's wheels against the floor was louder now, like a drumbeat, echoing the rhythm of her resolve. As she waited for his next move, Maya realized something important. This wasn't just a moment about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel invisible, unworthy, or small. And no matter how hard they tried, she was done being silent. The room seemed to hold its breath as Steve finally nodded, and with a reluctant sigh, he turned toward the gate. He was going to get the supervisor. Maya would have to wait a little longer, but she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't be waiting for much longer. This was only the beginning. The waiting area felt even colder now, the bustling energy of the airport contrasting sharply with the quiet tension that settled over Maya like a heavy blanket. Passengers milled about, oblivious to the struggle happening just a few feet away. Some glanced at her briefly before returning to their phones or magazines, while others whispered to their companions. Maya's eyes narrowed slightly as she caught snippets of conversation. Words like disruptive, entitled, and troublemaker floated through the air. She didn't care. She had heard it all before. She refused to be a passive participant in her own story. The fact that her worth, her very right to occupy the same space, was being questioned by a complete stranger, just because of her race, her gender, and her disability, was an affront she wasn't going to ignore. Maya wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. She had spent years running on tracks, defying expectations with each race. But this was different. This wasn't about crossing a finish line. This was about proving, once again, that she deserved to exist in the spaces that had always excluded her. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her coach, Coach Amina, who had been a guiding force in Maya's life for years. "Maya, stay strong. You've earned this. Don't let them take your power." Maya smiled faintly at the message, reading it twice. The words were like a lifeline, a reminder that she was not alone in this battle, even if she felt like she was standing at the edge of the world. She glanced around. More people were heading toward the boarding gates, some in first class, others in the economy section. The first-class passengers had their own designated lane, bypassing the rest of the crowd with an air of superiority that Maya couldn't help but notice. They walked with a kind of silent arrogance, not seeing the invisible line that divided them from the rest of the world. They were entitled, they believed, to better treatment. Maya wondered how many of them realized how deeply that entitlement ran, How many of them understood that people like her weren't meant to cross that line? But Maya had long since learned to fight against the weight of society's expectations. She had spent years defying limits, pushing herself harder than most could ever imagine. Now, the world was going to see just how far she could go. She shifted in her seat, checking her watch. More time had passed than she cared to acknowledge, and still, no sign of the supervisor. The cold air in the terminal seemed to grow heavier, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Steve reappeared, his face flushed with discomfort, as though he had been through some internal struggle. He was not alone this time. A woman stood beside him, a tall, composed figure in her mid-40s, dressed in a sharp corporate suit. Her badge read, Rebecca Williams, Senior Customer Service Manager. Rebecca's eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene. She seemed professional, her posture upright, her movements deliberate. But Maya saw the subtle tension in her shoulders as she looked down at Maya, then quickly back at Steve. Maya could tell from the way she carried herself that Rebecca was used to being in control, to managing situations that required delicate handling. But today, this wasn't going to be a delicate situation. Maya wouldn't allow it. "Miss Jenkins," Rebecca said, her voice smooth but firm, "I understand there's been some confusion regarding your seating arrangements. I'm here to resolve it." Maya met her gaze, refusing to back down. "There's no confusion. I have a first-class seat, and I intend to sit in it." Rebecca hesitated for just a moment, a flash of unease crossing her features before she quickly masked it. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but you've been rebooked to a different section of the plane. We just need to ensure that you're as comfortable as possible." Maya's lips pressed together, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Comfortable. The word echoed in her mind like a bitter aftertaste. It wasn't about comfort. It was about respect. They were trying to placate her, to offer her a seat in a less visible section of the plane. Out of sight, out of mind. They wanted her to be content with the scraps they offered. "No," Maya said, her voice rising slightly, firm but controlled. "I didn't ask for a rebooking. I paid for a seat in first class, and that's where I'm going to sit." Rebecca's expression faltered for a split second, her gaze flickering to Steve, who was now standing awkwardly to the side, his face pale. "I understand your frustration," she said, her tone shifting to one of forced empathy. "But we have to take into consideration the accessibility needs of all passengers and—" "No," Maya interrupted, cutting through the words. Her voice was quieter now, but it held a quiet power that was impossible to ignore. "I've spent my life fighting to be seen, to be given the same respect as anyone else, and you don't get to tell me where I belong. I am not a charity case. I'm a paying customer, just like anyone else here, and I will not be treated like I don't deserve the seat I've earned." There was a tense silence that followed, as Rebecca and Steve exchanged a brief, unreadable glance. It was clear that Maya had caught them off guard. The people around her, once quietly murmuring and shifting uncomfortably, were now completely still, watching the scene unfold with bated breath. Maya felt the eyes on her, but she refused to be shaken. This was bigger than her. This was about every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Every person who had been silenced, dismissed, ignored. Today, she wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for all of them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rebecca spoke again, her voice now quieter, but no less resolute. "We will make an exception, Miss Jenkins," she said, her words calculated, like she was choosing each one carefully. "Your seat in first class is available, but I must ask that you allow us to assist you with boarding and any special accommodations you might need." Maya looked at her, a mixture of disbelief and defiance in her eyes. She knew what this was, a gesture meant to calm the storm, to make her feel like she was getting what she wanted, without truly addressing the heart of the issue. But she wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. "No," Maya said once more, her voice unwavering. "I don't need assistance. What I need is for you to treat me with the same dignity you'd extend to anyone else here. I don't want your exceptions. I want you to do what's right. I want my seat in first class, no more, no less." Rebecca's face stiffened, the polite smile now fading into something more neutral. But behind her eyes, Maya saw something shift, a flicker of recognition, as though Rebecca was finally realizing that Maya wasn't just another passenger to be managed. And then, Rebecca nodded slowly. "All right," she said, her voice tinged with something that might have been respect, though it was hard to tell. "We'll make sure you're seated in first class. Please, come with me." As Rebecca turned toward the gate, Maya rolled her wheelchair behind her, her head held high, every muscle in her body ready for whatever came next. She had won this round, but the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The quiet murmur of the crowd was still there, still watching. But Maya didn't hear them anymore. She had crossed the line they had drawn, and now there was no going back. As Maya followed Rebecca down the jet bridge, her heart pounded in her chest. The noise of the terminal, the buzz of whispered conversations, the quickened footsteps of hurried passengers, all of it seemed to fade into the background. The only thing that mattered now was her next step, her next action. She was no longer just a passenger. She was a symbol of defiance, of everything that had been denied to people like her for far too long. The jet bridge was quiet, eerily so, the soft hum of the plane's engines vibrating beneath their feet. Maya glanced at the door to the first-class cabin as they approached. The large, polished doors stood tall, a barrier between her and the world she had earned entry to. The gold lettering above the door gleamed. First class. It was almost as if the words mocked her, taunting her for having to fight so hard to be allowed entry into a space that was supposed to be hers by right. Rebecca stopped just before the door, her fingers hovering over the handle, as if waiting for some cue from Maya. Maya could feel the tension in the air, a delicate silence that hung between them. She could almost hear Rebecca's thoughts. Was she regretting the decision? Was she still trying to find a way to undo what she had just promised? Maya didn't care. She had pushed this far, and there was no turning back now. "Go ahead," Rebecca said softly, finally breaking the silence, though her voice was laden with unspoken reservations. Maya didn't hesitate. She rolled her wheelchair forward, her hands gripping the wheels tightly as she passed through the door. It wasn't a victory yet, not in the full sense, but it was a moment, an important one. The first-class cabin, with its plush seats and rich, polished wood, suddenly felt foreign to her. These were the seats she had always dreamed of occupying, but they were also the seats she had been made to feel unworthy of. Her fingers brushed against the armrests as she maneuvered her chair past the rows, feeling the weight of every eye on her. There was a collective pause from the passengers seated, their gazes drifting toward her. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable, and a few, Maya noticed, looked away quickly, as if the sight of her in that seat made them nervous. She could hear the hushed whispers, the subtle gasps, but she didn't look up. She couldn't afford to. She had earned this. Rebecca, following closely behind, stopped a few feet from Maya, her posture straight, professional. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Miss Jenkins?" she asked, her voice now carefully neutral. Maya nodded, her eyes scanning the cabin, taking in the luxury of the space, the grandeur of it all. She was acutely aware of the weight of the moment, the room, the people, the system she had just challenged. "I'm fine," she said firmly, not allowing herself to be cowed by the tension in the air. "Thank you." Rebecca lingered for a moment longer before nodding. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to call for assistance." As the supervisor turned and walked back down the aisle, Maya took a deep breath, letting the weight of the situation settle in her chest. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. Not yet. Not until everyone realized that this wasn't about the seat, or the plane, or even her wheelchair. This was about challenging the idea that people like her didn't belong in spaces like these. She sank into her seat, the soft leather cushioning around her, but her mind was still racing. Maya glanced around the cabin again, noting the looks, the stares, the way some passengers subtly shifted away from her, as if her presence was unsettling. She was used to it, used to the uncomfortable silence that followed her wherever she went, the awkwardness that people tried to hide behind their polite smiles. She had lived it her whole life, but today was different. She wasn't just an athlete on a plane. Today, she was the embodiment of something larger. The seatbelt sign clicked off, and the plane slowly started to move, the roar of the engines becoming louder as they taxied toward the runway. Maya felt the vibrations beneath her, the anticipation in the air, but all she could focus on was the journey ahead. This wasn't just a flight to New York. This was a flight towards something bigger, something that, deep down, she had been fighting for her entire life. As the plane lifted off, the world below her growing smaller with each passing second, she couldn't help but think of the countless others who had fought and were still fighting for the same recognition, for the same respect. The airliner climbed higher, the landscape disappearing beneath a sea of clouds. Maya closed her eyes, her hands still firmly gripping the armrests, her heart still racing. This was just the beginning, but as the flight continued, the small victories that had felt so monumental on the ground began to lose their significance. The quiet murmur of the other passengers, the polite but distant interactions from the flight attendants, they were all reminders of the uncomfortable truth that lingered beneath the surface. Maya wasn't naive enough to think that one moment, one flight, would change everything. It hadn't changed the way people saw her. It hadn't changed the way people saw others like her. It was late afternoon when the turbulence began. At first, it was just a gentle shake, the kind of wobble that comes with crossing through cloud cover. But soon, it grew stronger, the plane jolting as if it were being shaken by the very winds of injustice that Maya had always fought against. The passengers around her, once stiff and uncomfortable with her presence, now seemed more unnerved by the rocking of the plane. Their faces tensed, their bodies stiffened. Maya, however, remained calm. She had lived through worse. But then, something unexpected happened. The flight attendants began to move more rapidly through the aisles, murmuring to each other, checking on the passengers with increasing urgency. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, his words strained as he explained the turbulence and assured everyone that it would soon pass. But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something more than just bad weather. And then, a flight attendant approached her. He was tall, with blonde hair and a kind smile, but there was something in his eyes, something cold that made her uneasy. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, "we need you to move to a different area. We need to ensure your safety." Maya raised an eyebrow, her heart rate quickening. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight with tension. "The turbulence is too severe for you to stay here. We need you to move to a different section," he said, his tone still polite, but insistent. She had heard this before, the concern for her safety, the gentle insistence that she didn't belong where she had fought to be. The same subtle, insidious way people made her feel like she was an inconvenience. "I'm fine," Maya said, her voice cold now. "I'm not moving." The flight attendant hesitated, but his eyes flickered toward the front of the cabin, then back to her. "It's for your safety," he repeated, his voice now tinged with a note of authority. But Maya's resolve was already hardening. Not this time. Not again. As the turbulence rattled the plane, Maya knew one thing for certain. The battle wasn't over. It never would be. And she was prepared to fight for every inch of space she was entitled to. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all those who had been silenced, sidelined, and dismissed. And she would never let anyone take that away from her. The flight attendant stood there, his expression unreadable but his posture rigid, as if waiting for Maya to relent. His words, polite but insistent, felt like an invisible weight pushing down on her shoulders. The turbulence had grown worse, the shaking more pronounced. But Maya's resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't about to give in. Not now. Not when she had come this far. "I'm fine," Maya repeated, her voice steady. Though the grip on her wheelchair's armrests tightened, she could feel the tension in her body, a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Every part of her wanted to stand, to fight back against the subtle ways people like him tried to control her, to keep her in her place. But instead, she stayed seated, her back straight and her eyes locked on his. The flight attendant hesitated. His glance flickered toward the front of the cabin again, then back at Maya. He seemed torn between doing his job and recognizing the unspoken defiance in her eyes. Maya knew this look all too well. It was the same expression that Steve had worn back at the counter, the one that came from being forced into a situation that made them uncomfortable, a situation they hadn't planned for. His voice was softer this time, almost apologetic. "Miss Jenkins, I really must insist. For your own safety, we need to move you." Maya met his gaze without flinching, her breath steady. "You don't get to decide what's safe for me. I've dealt with far worse than this, and I'm not moving." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The turbulence continued to rattle the plane, but Maya didn't allow herself to be distracted. This was more than just the flight. It was a test of will, a moment to show that she wasn't going to be easily pushed around. And then, something shifted in the flight attendant's eyes. A subtle change, but a significant one. His posture softened just slightly, and his expression, once filled with duty, now held something else. Something like resignation, maybe even respect. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice still professional but less forceful. "I'll notify the captain that you're fine here. But if you need anything, please let us know." Maya nodded, finally allowing herself a small exhale. She had won this battle, at least for now. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment longer before walking away, his footsteps retreating down the aisle. Maya's eyes followed him, her mind still racing with the weight of what had just happened. The word stuck with her. It was the same word that had been used to justify so many other decisions that had been made for her, without her consent, without her voice. It was a word that people used to disguise their discomfort, to mask their unwillingness to see her as an equal, to justify pushing her aside. But Maya wouldn't let it slide this time. She had fought for too long to be treated as less than anyone else. The battle for her seat in first class had been just the beginning. She had made her stand. And now she could feel the momentum shifting. The world was watching, whether they liked it or not. The plane settled into a steadier rhythm, the turbulence subsiding, but Maya's thoughts remained in turmoil. She gazed out the window, watching the clouds swirl around the aircraft as the world below her seemed to shrink, becoming smaller and more distant with every passing second. She had climbed above the storms in the sky, but the real turbulence was still here, still waiting for her once the plane touched down. Her hand brushed against her phone, and a new message flashed across the screen. It was from Coach Amina, and the words sent a jolt through her chest. "Maya, I'm proud of you. Stay strong. But remember, this fight isn't just for you. It's for everyone who's been told they don't belong." The weight of those words hit her in a way that almost made her eyes sting. She had known, deep down, that this fight wasn't just about a first-class seat. It wasn't just about one moment. It was about something much larger, something that went beyond her, beyond the wheelchair, beyond the cabin of an airplane. This fight was for every person who had been told they didn't belong, for every individual who had ever been told their presence wasn't wanted. It was for every voice that had been silenced by the systems of oppression that tried to make them small. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, this time announcing their descent into New York. The time was coming. The world outside was about to open up, and Maya would be thrust back into the reality of her fight. She wasn't ready for it to be over. As the plane touched down, Maya felt the shift. The excitement of the journey's end was overshadowed by the quiet anxiety of what came next. Her heart beat a little faster as the aircraft taxied to the gate. She knew that the real test would begin as soon as the plane stopped. Once the door opened, she would face the crowd, the stares, the whispers, and the judgment that followed her wherever she went. But this time, she wasn't going to let it break her. Maya gathered her belongings, her mind already preparing for what was to come. She had proven her point on the plane. She had fought for the seat she deserved, and she would continue to fight for every other right, every other opportunity that had been denied her because of the color of her skin or the chair she sat in. As the seatbelt sign turned off and the passengers began to gather their things, a subtle shift happened. There was a murmur among the crowd, a quiet buzz as people exchanged looks. Maya could feel their eyes on her again, but this time, it wasn't the same. The discomfort had shifted. There was something different in the way they looked at her now. It was no longer the pity or the judgment. It was curiosity and a little bit of awe. She rolled toward the exit, moving through the cabin with a quiet confidence. But as she neared the front of the plane, something unexpected happened. A woman, an older passenger seated in the row near the front, stood up suddenly. She looked down at Maya, her expression unreadable, but then she stepped toward her, blocking the aisle for a brief moment. Maya paused, unsure of what to expect. The woman didn't speak at first. She just looked at her, almost as though she were seeing Maya for the first time, really seeing her. And then, she did something that made Maya's heart skip a beat. The woman reached out, placing her hand gently on Maya's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but one of understanding. And then, without a word, she simply smiled. A small, soft smile that held more weight than any apology or explanation ever could. Maya blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the moment. The woman didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The message was clear. I see you. Maya nodded in response, her chest tight with emotion. She rolled past the woman, the sense of recognition and solidarity filling her in a way that was almost overwhelming. She didn't need the approval of everyone around her. She didn't need their validation. What mattered now was that, for the first time in a long time, she had fought and won. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. She would not be silenced. Not now. Not ever. And as the doors opened to the bright New York City air, Maya knew that the world would have to face her, just as it had to face all those who had come before her and all those who would come after. The fight was far from over, but today, at least, she had made a stand. And that was enough to keep her going. As Maya stepped off the plane, the bustling energy of New York City hit her immediately. The sick, humid air of the terminal wrapped around her like a cloak. She could feel the weight of the world in each step she took, each foot forward, each wheel of her chair rolling on the polished floor, carrying more than just her body. It carried her story, her fight, her triumphs, and her setbacks. And now, as the door to the airport slid open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal and the flood of passengers spilling out toward baggage claim seemed almost too stark, too bright for her. It had been a long journey, both physically and emotionally. But Maya had won something greater than just the fight for a first-class seat. She had earned the right to take up space, to demand respect, and to be seen. And she knew, deep down, that this moment was just a sliver of a larger battle. But as her wheelchair rolled smoothly down the terminal's sleek hallway, she felt a shift. The world around her was still staring, but there was something different now. The whispers that had followed her since the beginning of the flight weren't about the color of her skin anymore, nor the chair she sat in. They weren't about the discomfort her presence created. No, now, there was something different in the air. Maya couldn't put her finger on it right away, but as she passed through the crowds, something had changed in the way people looked at her. There was a pause, a flicker of recognition in their eyes. Not judgment, not pity, just recognition. She wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time, it felt like people saw her not just as someone different, someone other. She wasn't the woman in a wheelchair. She wasn't just a black woman. They were seeing her as someone who had a right to be there, just as much as anyone else. It was a small shift, one that felt almost imperceptible, but it was enough to stir a quiet sense of accomplishment in Maya. The long, painful journey toward visibility, toward respect, was happening before her eyes, and she couldn't help but smile softly to herself. She turned the corner toward baggage claim, her mind already focused on the next step. The media, the press. They had been waiting for her arrival. Coach Amina had already given her the heads-up. They had been tracking her every move since she landed in New York. And that, she realized, was the moment the real challenge would begin. As Maya approached the baggage carousel, the sharp scent of travel and coffee hung in the air. A few steps ahead, a crowd had gathered. News cameras, photographers, and reporters who seemed to materialize out of thin air. Flashbulbs popped, and microphones were thrust in her direction before she even had a chance to process what was happening. "Miss Jenkins! Miss Jenkins!" A reporter called from the crowd, her voice sharp, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. "How does it feel to make history today?" Maya took a deep breath and paused. History. It was a word that had been used to describe many others. Athletes, revolutionaries, icons, People who had fought before her, broken barriers. But now, it was being used for her, too. She turned her chair slightly, facing the cameras and the sea of reporters. Her gaze locked on the closest microphone, her hands firmly gripping the armrests of her chair. She had done the hard work of confronting the system. Now, it was time to face the spotlight. "It feels like I'm just getting started," Maya said, her voice calm but steady, carrying the weight of her words with deliberate force. "Today, I'm here as a woman who fought for her seat, not just on this flight, but in every room, in every space, in every system that tries to tell people like me we don't belong. I'm not here for the applause. I'm here because this fight is bigger than me. It's about all of us. And I won't stop until the world understands that." The cameras clicked rapidly, capturing every word, every moment. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. She wasn't just a news story anymore. She was a statement, a woman who would no longer be silenced. Maya glanced around, seeing the mixture of admiration, confusion, and, yes, resentment from some of the crowd. It was inevitable. There were always those who resisted change, those who were threatened by the idea of equality, by the idea that everyone, no matter their race, their gender, their abilities, deserved to occupy the same spaces. But Maya knew, as she had always known, that these people weren't the ones she needed to convince. She wasn't fighting for the ones who refused to see her. She was fighting for the ones who did. The ones who saw her as a part of the world, not apart from it. A man in the crowd, a gruff, middle-aged figure in a suit, stepped forward, his eyes scanning her intently. His presence was commanding, and for a moment, the weight of his gaze made Maya tense. But then he spoke. "I've been watching your story," he said, his voice surprisingly warm. "I'm Thomas Green. I'm with a think tank focused on diversity and inclusion. You've sparked something, Maya. I'm convinced you're just the beginning of a much bigger change." Maya studied him carefully, her mind already running through the implications of what he was saying. There was a glint in his eyes, the kind of recognition that she wasn't just some passing story for a news cycle. He saw the bigger picture. "Teal, thank you," she said, nodding. "But this isn't about me. It's about everyone else who's been overlooked, denied, or pushed aside. This is just the start. It's time for people to stop seeing difference and start seeing equality." As she spoke, she could sense the shift again. The energy in the room had changed. The reporters, the onlookers, even the media outlets who had initially jumped at the opportunity to sensationalize her story were beginning to listen in a way that was more serious, more engaged. This wasn't just a moment for sound bites. This was a call to action. After a few more minutes of interviews and flashes from the cameras, Maya made her way out of the terminal and toward the exit. But as she moved through the crowd, something unexpected happened. One by one, people began to approach her. Not reporters, not camera crews, but everyday people. Some offered quiet words of thanks. Others simply nodded, acknowledging her presence with a kind of reverence she hadn't expected. A young black woman with a toddler in tow stopped her for a moment. She smiled at Maya with wide, grateful eyes. "I saw what you did today," the woman said softly. "Thank you. For all of us." Maya's chest tightened, the raw emotion of it washing over her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't anticipated the deep, personal impact of her actions on those who had been silently fighting the same battle. "It's for all of us," Maya replied, her voice steady but filled with a quiet strength. "For everyone who has ever been told they don't belong." And with that, Maya rolled forward. Her heart stilled with a quiet power. There was a long road ahead. The fight was far from over. But today, she had made a difference. She had taken up space. She had been heard. And as she stepped into the city streets, the wind carrying the sounds of New York around her, Maya knew this was only the beginning of something much, much bigger. The world had seen her. Now, it was time for the world to change. The journey Maya had started was far from finished. She had pushed through her own fears and limitations to claim her place. But what she had come to understand, as the city stretched out before her, was that every victory, no matter how small, was a step towards something greater, something that would shift the hearts and minds of all who had yet to see. The future wasn't going to be handed to her. But she was ready to fight for it, step by hard-fought step, and there was no stopping her now.